Didn't plan what I was going to say. I just stood there, hand on the doorknob, and let the silence do the work. My brother was the one who called ahead. He said my parents wanted to reconnect. That was the word he used, reconnect. Like we drifted apart at a summer barbecue. Like they hadn't told me 19 years ago that if I married Nathan, I was no longer their daughter. I was 22 when I walked out of their house in Columbus with a duffel bag and a man I loved more than I'd ever loved anything in my life. I was 34 when they stood on my porch in Portland, Oregon, looking older and smaller than I remembered, holding a casserole dish like a peace offering. I didn't cry, I didn't yell. I just opened the door a little wider and said, "Come in." Let me back up because the middle of a story is the worst place to start. I grew up in the kind of house that looked perfect from the outside. Colonial-style home in a good school district, 2 cars in the garage, my mother's garden winning a neighborhood association award 3 years running. My father was a cardiologist. My mother chaired every committee that would have her. They weren't bad people in the way that makes headlines. They were bad in the quieter, more suffocating way, the kind of bad that makes you feel crazy for naming it, because from the outside, everything looks so fine. I was their youngest. My brother Kevin, I'm still allowed to say his name, he didn't do anything wrong, was 4 years older than me and had the gift of becoming exactly who they wanted him to be without seeming to try. Pre-med at Ohio State, then cardiology like our father, then a wife from a family they approved of. He wasn't performing it. He genuinely wanted those things. I loved him for it, actually, because it took some of the pressure off me. But I was different, and I knew it early. I wanted to study architecture. My mother thought that was a hobby, not a career. I wanted to move out of Ohio. My father acted like I'd suggested moving to the moon. And when I was 21 and brought Nathan home for Thanksgiving, Nathan, who was Black, who had grown up in Cincinnati, who worked in logistics and was the funniest, steadiest, kindest person I had ever met. The temperature in that house dropped 10 degrees before anyone spoke a word. They didn't say anything explicit that weekend. My parents were too smart for that, but the looks passed between them. The way my mother kept steering the conversation away from him. The way my father barely shook his hand. I noticed. Nathan noticed. We drove back to Columbus in near silence, and when we got to his apartment, he just said, quietly, "You don't have to choose." And I said, "I know." But the truth was, I already had. 6 months later, Nathan proposed in the parking lot of a Kroger because the ring had arrived early and he couldn't wait another day. I said yes while holding a bag of groceries. It remains the most romantic moment of my life. When I told my parents, my mother went still in that particular way she had. Not shocked, exactly. More like she was calculating her response. My father set down his coffee cup very carefully. Then he said, and I will remember this sentence for the rest of my life, he said, "We didn't raise you for this." I asked him what this meant. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. My mother tried a different angle. She said they were worried about our cultural differences. She said she just wanted me to be happy. And didn't I think this would be so much harder than I realized? She said it in her gentlest voice, the one she used when she thought she was being kind. I told her I was happy. Right now, in this moment, standing in their kitchen, I was happy, and that was because of Nathan, not in spite of him. My father said, "If you go through with this, we're done." My mother said nothing, and that silence was its own sentence. I left that evening. I didn't slam the door. I closed it behind me like I was leaving a room, not a family. Nathan and I got married 4 months later in a small ceremony at the Botanical Garden in Columbus. My brother came. His wife did not. Nathan's entire family drove up from Cincinnati, aunts and cousins I'd only met twice, and they folded me in like I'd always been there. His mother danced with me at the reception. My father was not there. My mother sent a card, no note inside, just her signature. I kept it for years. I'm not sure why. The first year was hard in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not Nathan and me. We were good. We were genuinely good. but the absence of my parents was a specific kind of grief that I didn't know how to name. It wasn't like losing someone to death. It was more like they were still alive somewhere, choosing not to exist in my life, and that choice sat in my chest like a stone. I kept forgetting about until I'd roll over in the night and feel the weight of it. I threw myself into work. I'd graduated with a degree in architecture from Ohio State and had gotten a job at a mid-sized firm in Columbus. I was decent at the technical side, but what I was actually good at was the client-facing work, understanding what people wanted before they could articulate it, translating anxious, vague wishes into something real. My boss noticed. He gave me my own accounts by year 2. Nathan got a promotion that moved us to Portland. I was terrified. Portland was far. Portland was the moon as far as my Ohio brain was concerned. But I transferred to a larger firm there, and within 18 months, I was leading a team. Something about starting over in a new city agreed with me. I didn't have the weight of being anyone's daughter out there. I was just myself. We bought a house in a Selwood neighborhood when I was 28. Small, old, needed work. We did most of it ourselves on weekends, Nathan doing the demolition because he found it satisfying in some primal way, me doing the design decisions, both of us covered in drywall dust by Sunday evening and perfectly happy about it. We put in wood floors in the living room. We built a raised garden bed in the backyard. We had a good life. A genuinely good life. And then Nathan's company offered him a position in their Atlanta office. We sat with it for a long time. I didn't want to leave Portland. He didn't want to leave Portland. But the number they were offering was significant, and we talked for years about eventually moving closer to his family. Atlanta wasn't Cincinnati, but it was closer. We decided to go. I found a position at a boutique firm in Midtown within 3 weeks of arriving. The firm was small, 7 people, but the principal, a woman named Joan who wore linen suits and kept orchids on every windowsill, had a client list that made up for the headcount. She specialized in historic renovations and high-end residential work. I learned more in 2 years with her than I had in 6 years before. By 30, I had my own license. By 32, I had my first independent client. By 33, I had 4, then 9, then more than I could handle alone. I started a firm. That sounds dramatic. It was actually a Tuesday afternoon when I registered the LLC, sitting at my kitchen table in Atlanta with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. I named it after the street our Portland house had been on. Nathan thought that was sentimental. I thought it was honest. That house was where I had figured out what I was capable of. By the time I was 34, we had 8 employees and a project backlog that stretched 14 months. My brother called me that October. We had stayed in touch the whole time, texts, calls every few weeks, visits when we could manage them. He was careful about the subject of our parents. He didn't pretend they were fine people. He didn't ask me to forgive them. He just stayed in my life, which I understood as its own kind of loyalty. This call was different. He said our parents had been asking about us. Specifically, he said they had been asking about Nathan and me, whether we had children. I felt something cold move through me. We didn't have children. We had talked about it, wanted it, tried for 3 years. I'd had 2 miscarriages, one early, one at 14 weeks. The second one nearly flattened me. I took 6 weeks off work. I sat in rooms and stared at walls and let Nathan hold me and didn't talk much. Eventually, I came back to myself, but that version of myself had a new layer. Something quieter, something that knew a particular kind of loss now. We had decided after that to stop trying. Not forever, maybe, but for now. We needed to just live for a while without that specific hope and that specific grief cycling through us every few months. We were 33. We had time, maybe. Or we didn't. Either way, we needed a break from needing something so badly. My parents didn't know any of this. My parents didn't know anything about my life because they had removed themselves from it. I asked my brother why they were suddenly asking. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Grandpa's estate finally settled. There's money, a lot of it, and they want to... I think they want to make things right before. Before what? Dad had a health scare last spring. He's fine now, but I think it scared them. I sat with that. My father, the cardiologist, having a cardiac event. The irony was not lost on me, and I felt terrible for registering it. I told my brother I appreciated him telling me. I told him I needed some time. He said, "They're going to reach out directly. I just wanted you to hear it from me first." I thanked him. We hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. They called 2 days later. My mother on my cell phone, a number she must have gotten from my brother. I saw her name on the screen and I just watched it ring. I didn't feel panic. I didn't feel anger exactly. I felt something more like curiosity. What do you say to someone you haven't spoken to in 12 years? I let it go to voicemail. She said they were coming to Atlanta for a conference my father had and they would love to see us. She said she hoped we could have dinner. Her voice was careful, controlled, the same way it always had been. But underneath it there was something that might have been rehearsed. Or nervousness. With my mother it was always hard to tell. I talked to Nathan that night. He was the most measured person I knew, which is part of why I married him. He didn't tell me what to do, he just asked what I wanted. I said I wanted to look them in the face, I wanted to see who they were now, if they were different, if they understood anything. I said I wasn't expecting much. He said that seemed honest. I called my mother back the next morning and said they could come for dinner on Saturday. I spent the days before that dinner feeling nothing in particular, which concerned me more than if I'd felt everything. I cleaned the house with more thoroughness than it needed. I planned a menu. I set the table. I was organizing the external world because the internal one was too quiet to read. Nathan made his mother's baked chicken. He said it wasn't strategic. I believed him, and I also believed it was a little strategic, in the best way. The house smelled like something real and warm when they arrived at 6 o'clock. They looked smaller. That was the first thing I noticed. My father had always been a tall man, broad-shouldered, the kind of person who took up space without meaning to. He looked diminished now. Not sick, exactly, just reduced. My mother looked the same but softer somehow. She was wearing a cardigan I'd never seen. My mother hugged me at the door. I let her. It felt like holding a stranger. My father extended his hand to Nathan, and Nathan shook it, and whatever my father saw in his face in that moment, I don't know what it was, he said quietly, "It's good to meet you properly." Nathan said, "Yes." We had dinner. We talked about the house, my firm, the neighborhood. My parents asked careful questions. My mother admired the floors. My father asked about the kitchen renovation. It was almost normal, and almost was the thing that kept catching in my throat. After dinner, my mother helped me clear the plates. We were standing at the sink together, and she said without looking at me, "We made mistakes." I waited. "Your father and I, the way we handled things, we were wrong." I rinsed a glass. I set it in the drying rack. I said, "I know." She looked at me then. She said, "Can you forgive us?" And there it was, the sentence I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it, not because I needed it, I had built a whole life without it, but because it clarified something. The question wasn't really about me. It was about them. It was about whether they could close a chapter that had been sitting open, unresolved in their chests for 12 years. I thought about what I actually felt, not what I was supposed to feel, not what the moment seemed to call for. What I actually felt. I said, "I don't know yet." She nodded slowly, like she had expected that, like it was fair. We went back to the dining room. My father and Nathan were talking, actually talking, not performing conversation, about something to do with the Braves and a trade that apparently made no sense to either of them. I stood in the doorway for a second and just watched. This was my life. This room, this man, this table we'd found at an estate sale on a Saturday morning 2 years ago. My parents sitting in chairs in my house. I had built this, without them. They came back the next morning for coffee before their flight. My mother brought pastries from a bakery near their hotel. My father sat at our kitchen table and looked out the window at the backyard, at the garden beds Nathan had built last spring, and he said, "You did well." He meant it generally. The house, the life, all of it. He meant it the way a person means something when they've run out of other words. I said, "Yes, we did." He looked at me. Something crossed his face. Not quite regret. Something adjacent to it. The version of regret that sits with a person long enough that it stops feeling sharp and just becomes a kind of permanent low-grade ache. I recognized it actually because I had felt something like it myself, for different reasons. He said, "I'm glad you're happy." I believed him. Before they left, my mother hugged me again at the door. This time I hugged back a little more. Not all the way, but more. My father on the porch steps turned around and said, "Nathan is..." He stopped, started again. "He's good for you. Anyone can see that." Nathan, standing beside me, said, "Thank you, sir." After they were gone, I stood in the quiet of my friend hall for a long moment. Nathan came and stood next to me without saying anything. Then he said, "Well." I said, "Yeah." He put his arm around me and we went back inside. I'm not going to tell you it was fixed after that. It wasn't. There were more dinners, more careful conversations, more moments of almost normal that sometimes made it and sometimes didn't. My mother overstepped once and said something about us still having time when the subject of children came up, and I had to leave the room. My father still struggled, sometimes visibly, with how to be in a space where he wasn't the authority. Old habits don't dissolve. They thin, slowly, if the people involved are willing to do the work. They were willing to do some of the work, not all of it, but some. I talked to a therapist about what forgiveness actually meant for me, because I'd been using the word without being sure what it contained. She said something that stayed with me, that forgiveness wasn't the same as trust, and it wasn't the same as closeness, and it didn't require me to pretend the past had been different than it was. It just meant I was willing to stop carrying it as the defining weight of my present. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about the 22-year-old who had walked out of a house in Columbus with a duffel bag and no real plan, how scared she had been underneath the certainty, how much she had needed someone to tell her she was making the right choice, and how she had had to be that person for herself. I thought about the floors we put in the Portland house, the drywall dust, the garden beds. I thought about Nathan on the phone with my brother every Christmas, carefully not making it weird. I thought about the firm, the 14-month backlog, the Tuesday afternoon I'd registered an LLC at my kitchen table. I had built a life from what they refused to give me. That was real. It stayed real regardless of what happened next. The night after my parents left, I went out to the backyard and sat in one of the Adirondack chairs Nathan had painted green last summer. The Atlanta air was cooling down, finally, the way it does in October when the city remembers it's allowed to have an autumn. I sat there for a while and just let myself feel whatever was actually there, not the shape of what I thought I should feel, just the actual texture of it. It was complicated. It was heavy and also lighter than it had been. It was not resolved exactly. It was open in a way that felt different from before, less like a wound, more like a window. I went back inside. Some things you carry, some things you set down, and some things you hold loosely, neither keeping nor releasing, learning to live with the weight of them differently than you once did. My parents are not the people I needed them to be. They are the people they are, limited, late, trying in the incomplete way that people try when they have spent decades being certain of things that turned out to be wrong. I am not the daughter they planned for. I am the one who built something anyway. I think, in the end, that's the part that matters. I used to think the hardest part of what happened was the night I left. Closing that door in Columbus, duffel bag in hand, not knowing what came next. But looking back now, I don't think that was the hardest part at all. The hardest part was the years after, learning to stop waiting for them to come around and building a life anyway, in the silence of that waiting. There's something I've come to understand about the choices people make and the ones they don't. My parents didn't lose me in a single moment. They lost me slowly, decision by decision, starting long before I brought Nathan home for Thanksgiving. Every time they chose their image over my truth. Every time they mistook control for love. Those were the moments it unraveled. And the outcome, when it finally came, wasn't punishment. It was just the natural weight of those choices, accumulated over years, finally settling where it belonged. That's the thing about how we treat people. It doesn't disappear, it lives somewhere quietly until life makes room for it to surface. What I didn't expect was what I found on the other side of losing them. I found out what I was actually made of. Not because someone told me, not because a situation was handed to me, but because I had no other option but to find out. I scrubbed my way through the early years. I studied, I built, I failed at some things, I tried again at others. Nathan and I put floors in with our own hands. I registered an LLC on a Tuesday afternoon at my kitchen table. None of it was glamorous. All of it was mine. There's a kind of intelligence that only comes from having to figure things out for yourself, not the kind you get from being supported, which is its own gift, but the kind you develop when the support isn't there and you have to become the person who provides it. I became that person. It changed how I think, how I work, how I lead the people at my firm. I don't take credit for the hard things that happened to me, but I do take credit for what I chose to do with them. And the integrity piece, that one took me longer. It would have been easier at dinner that night to perform forgiveness I didn't feel, to give my mother the answer she needed, to smooth everything over and let us all pretend. I've seen people do that. I understand why, but I couldn't do it. When she asked me if I could forgive them, I said I didn't know yet because that was the true answer. And truth was the thing I had protected all along, even when it cost me. I'm not the daughter they planned for. I stopped grieving that a long time ago. Nathan is asleep in the next room right now. The firm has a project deadline on Friday. There's a garden in the backyard that needs tending. My parents are in Columbus, and we talk sometimes, carefully, imperfectly, with all the weight of history still in the room. It's not a clean ending, but it's an honest one. And I think I've learned more than anything else that honesty is the foundation. Do right by people. Think clearly about what's actually true. And when the world takes something from you, find out who you are without it. That's the life I built. That's the one worth keeping.